Good morning, Pleasant View, and hope you're doing well. Hope you're staying healthy and finding things to keep yourself preoccupied and busy during this time of quarantine. I did want to give a few updates and announcements, just run through the list of things we want you to stay informed about. One new thing this week, hopefully, you received an email from the church regarding planned guided Mother's Day craft that Pastor Jason is planning to work on with the children. So if you haven't gotten that email, please contact Jason if you've got kids, and they would, I'm sure, enjoy doing that together. And then also, just a reminder of our ongoing Sunday morning messages. If you're watching this, you're probably aware of it, but one additional feature you might desire to partake in is we're going to begin streaming on Facebook Live the pre-recorded messages at 11 a.m. every Sunday. In fact, today we're beginning that today. So if that's something you would enjoy connecting with several others from our church kind of at the same time on a Facebook Live platform where you can kind of say hello to those who are showing up, let them know you're there, and just a chance for lots of people to kind of say hello beforehand and maybe continue some discussion after the message or something together. We want to make that available to you starting today. So be aware of that. And then also Sunday evenings, we are continuing our study called Foundations that Pastor Kevin is leading from 6 o'clock to about 7 o'clock every Sunday evening on the basic foundational doctrines of the faith. And everyone is welcome to join and participate in that interactive Bible study. That's through Zoom. And you'll need to contact Pastor Kevin to get the login information for that so that you can participate. Also, Wednesday nights, remember, we have our weekly prayer meeting at 6:30. That begins with a short devotional, followed up by a time of prayer on Facebook Live. And then similarly, every weekday morning, there is a chance for you to engage on Facebook Live in a morning devotional led by Jason or Kevin. And then Mondays and Fridays, we have a guided prayer that Pastor Jason puts out around 4:30 on those 2 days that you can tune into whenever you're getting ready for bed as an evening reflection or meditation and prayer time. So just be aware of those various things that we're doing. And then don't forget a couple opportunities we've put out there for our folks to be engaged in the community. You know, it's kind of hard to engage with folks in our community when we're asked to be quarantined and we're not having our times of getting together at public gatherings and so on. But a couple ways that you can still minister to people during this time if you're looking for ways to be involved and be active. One of those is by collecting some food. If you remember, there's a specific list of things that we have been asked to help collect and drop off at the church. Those will be taken to Combined Community Services facility each week, and those are helping to provide food for people who are having to have their kids at home all day, and they're having to feed them where they're used to having more of those meals at the school and such. And so particularly people who are financially strapped, those go to help them. And then additionally, they are looking for volunteers who can help drive and deliver food at different times throughout the week. There's really two different organizations looking for that sort of help. One is looking for help with our seniors, our older folks, our elderly folks within the community who have meals delivered to them, and they need more people who can help to drive and deliver those meals. And then similarly, the Warsaw schools, as they are trying to deliver meals, thousands of meals throughout each week to folks with school-age kids, and they're looking for people to help drive and distribute those. So if you're available throughout the day, some days, and you'd be willing to volunteer to help drive and deliver food, contact Kevin for more information about that. Well, I've got with me this morning a couple different examples of shoes from my closet. And I want you to consider how shoes are made with very different purposes in mind, depending on what the shoe's to be used for. So this here is a snow boot. And as a snow boot, you can see it's designed to be worn in snow. It's made high so that your ankles aren't getting wet. You don't want that snow coming up into your pant leg, and so it's nice and high. It's also got a thick insulated material that it's made from to keep your feet warm in the cold weather. And then, as you can kind of tell here, all around the bottom, the part that's going to be in the snow, including the bottom the most, it's made of rubber material, something that's completely waterproof. The bottom is made for traction, even on ice, and so it's designed to be worn in snow. Now here's a very different shoe. This is a running shoe that I had in my closet. Haven't used these a whole lot very often, but you can tell this is designed in very different ways than the snow boot because it's designed with a different purpose in mind. And so this shoe is very lightweight. It's maybe a fourth of the weight of the snow boot. It's also made of a very breathable material so that if you're out running, your feet tend to get hot if they're sweaty. This helps it to breathe. And you can kind of tell the heel. It's got these little hollow parts here. It's made to be very springy, and it kind of gives a nice bounce to it. And so, everything about this shoe was designed with running in mind and athletics. Here's a different type of athletic shoe, but it's made very specifically for soccer. And so, most notable is on the bottom, you've got these cleats that are made to stick into the ground, and they give you traction when you're running, particularly somebody who needs to stop and start on a grassy surface very quickly. That's what the cleats are designed for. It also has a couple other interesting facets to it. If you can see here, the shoelaces actually go down toward the outside. So most shoes, they kind of go right down the middle, but these are off-centered going down the outside because in soccer, you're trying to dribble a soccer ball, and you typically use the inside of your foot for that. And so even something as small as the shoelaces could mess up the feel of the ball and cause you not to be able to control the ball quite as well. And then one more thing here is the tongue of this shoe is made to come down over the shoelaces. And once again, if as you're trying to pass a soccer ball or you're trying to control it, this is made to keep the shoelaces from getting in the way, to keep them from interfering with your feel of the ball as you're passing it with your feet. And so, again, you can see how shoes were designed to provide the necessary support and to help you accomplish a particular task. Here's one more type of footwear, and this is water shoes or water sandals. These are made of everything on them is rubber or vinyl or some sort of waterproof material. You could literally walk through a creek with these and it wouldn't be a problem. Very flexible. They're made to kind of come on and off very easily. Because if you're wearing these at a water park, if you're wearing them at the beach, typically you don't want to have them on the whole time, and you don't want to have to get down and untie them and retie them, and so they're made to be able to be put on and taken off very easily. This particular pair is also very cheap. Everything it's made with is a very cheap material. I think I probably paid less than $10 for these. And the idea is if you're at a water park or someplace at a beach and you take them off to go get in the water, and you come back and they've been unattended, if somebody else has swiped them, you don't have to worry about them being, valuable. So, you're only out a little bit of money. And so really everything about these have been designed with the idea of somebody who wants to use them to get wet, but they're not going to keep them on. They want to put them on and off. And so shoes are designed with a purpose because whenever you're engaging in activities outdoors in particular, you have to think about how to protect the feet. We've been in the midst of a study entitled Unmasking the Enemy. And this is a series on our spiritual battle against Satan. And we're currently in kind of we're slowing things down as we work through Ephesians chapter 6, which is kind of the main passage that the series comes from. And Paul is working through the pieces of armor, or Christian's armor. Now, we don't typically think of shoes as a type of armor. And in the truest sense, that's because they're not armor in the sense like a breastplate of righteousness or a shield of faith or a helmet of salvation. Those are defensive pieces of armor that are intended to shield the body from different types of blows, from different kinds of weaponry, whether it's arrows or sword thrusts or spears or what have you. What we're going to look at this morning are referred to as the shoes of the readiness of the gospel of peace. Now that's long. I've just referred to this as the shoes of peace. But these shoes were likely not intended to serve as armor like the rest of the pieces of armor would have been thought of. But they were super important nonetheless. I mean, imagine a soldier showing up for battle in the first century or today barefoot. Imagine if he says, I'm ready to go, and he doesn't have any shoes on. That you'd think that was so foolish. He would be so disadvantaged because shoes, going into battle, there's various things they're going to consider. They're going to consider the mobility of the soldier, his ability to move quickly, and they're also going to consider traction. And so what we know of from the first century soldiers' equipment was that they wore a type of a boot or a sandal. We might kind of call it a in between, kind of the two of those. It was made from leather, but this leather came up the ankle some, up the lower leg, and it wasn't solid leather like we think of as boots. It was opened on the sides. The side of the foot would have been open more like a sandal, and that would have made it so that the foot could breathe some, but the foot could move around easily. But this was a nice, thick, durable leather that the shoe would not have fallen off if they needed to run quickly in battle. And then on the bottom, the soles of the foot of these shoes were made with several layers of leather. And then they either had some kind of studs, hollow studs on the bottom, we're told, or they would put nails through them that would provide kind of like a cleat. It would give them traction so that they could move quickly. They had mobility, traction, durability, just general protection for the bottoms of their feet. You can imagine if you're on a war campaign for several days, if you're out there barefoot or in the wrong kind of shoes, and your feet would develop, the bottoms of your feet would develop blisters and so on. That would not be a good thing. And so this was the purpose of the soldier's boot or war sandals that we're looking at. Ephesians chapter 6. Verses 11, and then I'm going to read verses 14 and 15. Here he says, "Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. Stand, therefore, having fastened on the belt of truth, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness, and as shoes for your feet, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace." As I said, I've entitled this message, "The Shoes of Peace." Now, this phrase that we are looking at here, specifically verse 15, that describes this piece of armor, is a bit unclear at first glance exactly what he's referring to. Literally, it says something of the sort of having shod the feet with readiness of the gospel of peace. Having shod the feet with readiness of the gospel of peace. Now some translations translate it more or less in that literal fashion. The King James, New American Standard, they all have a very literal translation of that phrase, which is one approach to it. However, some have been critical of that because we typically just wouldn't say things like that in English. We wouldn't typically refer to something as the shoes of readiness of the gospel of peace, kind of, that stringing together of statements. And so other translations have attempted, most translations have attempted to clarify what they think it likely means by explaining one of those of relationships there grammatically. And there's two different ways that I see translations translating this that has really a different meaning to it depending on which choice they make. And so some refer to a readiness that comes from the gospel for the person who's putting the shoes on. So in other words, the gospel has impacted the person putting the shoes on in some sense that it's brought them peace. And somehow then the implication is that Paul is urging them to put on shoes that metaphorically refer to them putting on a readiness to appropriate the peace that they already have in some practical way, if that makes sense. So, for example, the English Standard Version says, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. The New International Version says, with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. So again, these see the gospel of peace as bringing some sort of readiness to the person putting them on. The other way of understanding this is a readiness to take the gospel of peace to others. And so the New Revised Standard and the Revised Standard Version say something like, as shoes for your feet, put on whatever will make you ready to proclaim the gospel of peace. Likewise, the Holman Christian Standard Bible says, having your feet sandaled with readiness for the gospel of peace. And then there's a little footnote there which says, ready to tell others about the gospel. And so some translations see this more literal idea of having your feet shod with a readiness of the gospel of peace as a readiness to take the gospel of peace to others. And then other translations see it as a readiness to sort of appropriate the peace that you've already gotten because you've embraced the gospel as a Christian. So the question is, well, which one is it? And I think that a good case can probably be made. I think there's enough valid arguments that there's some of both intended here. I think it's possible that Paul worded this the way he did, intentionally vague, because it encapsulates a little more broadly both concepts. There's a sense in which, as Christians, there is a piece of sorts that we have that we need to appropriate in our own lives, and then there's a piece that the gospel brings that we need to be ready to take to others. And there's a readiness related to this gospel of peace that we need to be ready to apply to ourselves and to others. And so we're going to look at both this morning, both possibilities, because I think both are intended here. So the first thing that I want us to consider is this. We must put on a readiness to obtain peace with God for those outside the church. We must put on a readiness to obtain peace with God for those outside the church. It's sort of the idea of taking the gospel to the lost. So, I think there's a couple different reasons why this is one of the likely intended parts of the metaphor that Paul was trying to convey here. I think, first of all, when you think of shoes, the imagery of shoes naturally conjures up the metaphor of going to others. That when you think of putting on shoes, you think of taking something to others or going somewhere. And I think particularly when you think of shoes in the context of the gospel, we naturally think of the metaphor as taking the gospel to those who need it, being ready to go to people with the gospel, the Great Commission. Go into all the world and proclaim the gospel to every creature. It would make sense that part of a Christian's mindset, part of what he does to be ready to resist Satan, is that this sense of the main purpose of his life, the Great Commission, that which we are to be all about, is part of our daily mindset. Am I prepared today? Am I ready today to take the gospel to people that God brings into my life? And so, beyond that, I think there's further evidence from the context of the book of Ephesians as a whole. Several scholars who write in commentaries about the armor of God, they make the observation that the armor of God is sort of not a totally new section in the book of Ephesians where Paul kind of begins with a whole new line of thinking. Everything in Ephesians chapter 6 talking about the armor of God are picking up on themes that have already been developed earlier in the book of Ephesians. In essence, it's kind of the climax of the book of Ephesians when it comes to how we as believers should live as we combat Satan. And so all of the things in chapter 6 have really been developed earlier in the epistle. And so this idea of the gospel and this idea of peace, how does it come up earlier in the book? Does that give us insight into how to understand what Paul likely means here where he makes this somewhat vague metaphor to a pair of shoes? And I think what we can see is that one of the elements of the gospel that is highlighted earlier in the book of Ephesians is the way in which the gospel brings peace to people who are outside of fellowship with God, and it helps bring them into a relationship with God. Ephesians chapters 1 and 2 talk quite a bit about the blessings that come from those who appropriate the gospel into their life and they receive forgiveness of sins. Probably the most familiar part of those chapters is Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, where we're told that it is by grace that you have been saved through faith. And this is not of your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. So there's this sense of the normal aspect that we think of when we think about the gospel of peace. It's a gospel that brings peace between God and men, a reconciling of a relationship between the Creator and His created beings. But then thirdly, I want you to consider, and we're going to touch on this every week. Last 2 weeks we've pointed this out, but each of the pieces of armor seem to have a connection into the Old Testament book of Isaiah. And Paul seems to be pulling metaphors out of the book of Isaiah where there are these references to these aspects of clothing or armor that have a correlation. He doesn't use them always in exactly the same way that they're used by the prophet Isaiah, but there's usually some relationship to the context there. And so specifically here, almost every commentary that I look at, in fact, probably every one of them, I can't think of any that I read this week that didn't suggest that there was a likely allusion to Isaiah chapter 52. Particularly in verse 7, it references how beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, or the gospel, who publishes peace, who brings good news of happiness, who publishes salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. So again, as I was studying Isaiah 52, the broader context, what's going on here? Well, here the prophet is speaking to Israel who are in exile. But they're getting ready to come out of exile. They're being brought out. And specifically, he talks about those who were sold as slaves, and he uses the language of grace. He says in verses 2 and 3, he says, loose the bonds from your neck, O captive daughter of Zion. For thus says the Lord, you were sold for nothing, and you shall be redeemed without money. In other words, you were sold as slaves into captivity. And you were sold for nothing. But they didn't get any money for selling you into captivity. He says, I'm not going to charge you money to bring you out. I'm not going to redeem you by something that you have to pay for. You're going to be redeemed without money. It's a free act by God to redeem them. Then several verses later in verse 7, I've already read that verses where he says, referring to the people who are coming to the city of Jerusalem, proclaiming this message of deliverance from captivity and from their oppressors. And it says, how beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings this gospel, or this good news, who publishes peace. It's a message of peace. Who brings good news of happiness, who publishes salvation. Notice the language of salvation. Who says to Zion, to Jerusalem here, your God reigns. God is doing something for you. And so a little bit later then, in verses 5 and chapter 53 of Isaiah, just one chapter later, and it's not very far after this portion of Isaiah 52, this is where we have the most famous and well-known and clear example of the gospel in the Old Testament of Isaiah chapter 53, the suffering servant. This is where it's said to Israel, he, referring prophetically to Jesus, he was pierced for your transgressions. He was crushed for your iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. Again, notice the reference to Jesus and his salvation act bringing about peace. And with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one of us to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him, on Jesus, the iniquity of us all. And so there's the Old Testament context of Isaiah that Paul was likely leaning on when he was bringing about this own analogy of footwear or feet that go, and going, they proclaim the gospel and they bring peace in the process. So you have this Old Testament allusion as well as the references here in Ephesians. I think it highlights for us that this is probably a significant element of what Paul refers to now in chapter 6, as he encourages his audience, kind of in summary fashion, to, on a regular basis, put on the readiness of your feet, put on the readiness of the gospel of peace. So that this begs the question, and well, how does a readiness to share Christ with others protect us from Satan's attacks? And I've already alluded to this, but let me just make sure that you caught this. You know, really, Jesus' mission for his followers was summed up in the Great Commission. Go and make disciples, make followers of me. In other words, go and take the good news of the gospel to others. This is where life is to be all about. Now, Satan's tactics, we know he's out to distract us, to kind of get us looking over here when we should be looking over here. He's out to distract us, to keep us from being on mission, to keep us from what our real purpose is. And beyond that, Satan, one of Satan's biggest strategies, we're told in Scripture, is that he is the blinder of the lost. He keeps them from seeing their need for the gospel. He blinds them of the realities of the gospel. Now, how would we as Christians be able to thwart what Satan is doing as the one who blinds the minds or blinds the eyes of the unbeliever? Well, the only way that their minds are going to be enlightened, the only way that their spiritual eyes are going to see, is if we go to them and present the truth to them and open up and share with them the truth of the gospel and their need for it of peace. And so certainly it makes sense that Satan would try to attack us by subtly keeping us from being on mission, that we wouldn't be ready to talk to the people that come up in our life, that when we run into someone and the conversation, kind of an open door is presented, we're just not ready to walk through it. We're not in the right mindset. Maybe we're not ready in the sense of being prepared to know how to share something with them or how to talk to them. And so I think there's probably two primary ways that Satan keeps believers unprepared or keeps them silent as it relates to the gospel. One of those ways is that he deceives us into believing that we won't know what to say. If we open our mouths to talk, we won't know what to say. Now, frankly, this could be true. There are plenty of believers who wouldn't know what to say. They're not prepared in that sense. They're not ready in the sense of having thought through, how would I define the gospel? How would I answer questions about why people need the gospel? Why Jesus and not Buddhism or other approaches to answering life's questions? And I think this is why Peter, elsewhere in his first epistle, says that he tells his audience, always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks for a reason for the hope that is in you. Interestingly, this word that's translated here, prepared, always be prepared, always be ready, is the same exact word that Paul uses in Ephesians 6, the putting on the shoes of readiness, the shoes of preparedness. And so, part of what it means to put on daily those shoes of readiness is that we've taken the time to prepare ourselves, that we do try to stay aware of what some of the reasons are that people in our day and age reject the gospel, and to be aware, well, how would I respond to that sort of a person? Particularly if you've got a friend and you've had a conversation and they bring something up and you don't know, I'm not sure how I would answer that you take the time to go and research and talk to people, read some books, listen to videos on YouTube. There's so many excellent resources out there that help Christians be better prepared to engage within their culture with the gospel. And so part of what it means to put on these shoes of readiness, I believe, to be able to combat Satan, is that we are ready to, when Satan puts that thought in our mind, oh, you shouldn't open your mouth and talk about the gospel because you won't know what to say. Yeah, I think I would know what to say. I might not have every answer, but I think I would have some things valuable to say because you're prepared. You've got some videos, some books, some messages you've listened to in mind. And so that's the first element of how he deceives us, by causing us to believe that we won't know what to say. But secondly, he deceives us, I believe, he deceives us into believing that other people aren't interested in hearing about Jesus. They don't want to hear that. This is going to be awkward if you bring this up. They don't want you to share what Jesus means to you. They don't want you to ask if you can pray with them. That's kind of foolishness in their thoughts. There's really a whole narrative today. I mean, if you listen to the news, if you listen to a lot of secular college classrooms, or reading books, or just whatever, there's a lot of messaging out there along these lines that basically say that people today view religion as a topic that shouldn't be brought up. It's taboo. It's worse than politics. You should keep it to yourself. It's rude to inject religious talk or faith talk into conversations, and people are put off by it. And that's just a very common theme or motif that runs throughout our society, and I think it comes from Satan. I think it's part of Satan's strategy within the world to silence those of us in the church. But there's an interesting book that I've just been reading recently. In fact, it's a very new book. It's a book entitled You Found Me, written by Rick Richardson. And in this book, it's really about a lot of research that was done around unchurched people, or culturally what are referred to as nones, N-O-N-E-S, those who have no religious affiliation at all, whether they're atheist, agnostic, or something else. They just don't identify themselves through a religious label. And it was primarily targeted at understanding that group of people, the unchurched and the religious nones, particularly also highlighting millennials and their generation. And the subtitle is New Research on How Unchurched Nones, Millennials, and Irreligious Are Surprisingly Open to the Christian Faith. Now, in this book, they've done a lot of research through Lifeway Christian Research, Pew Research, on how those people respond to questions about faith. And interestingly, for example, 79% of unchurched people say that they are fine with Christian friends talking about their faith if it's important to them. In other words, almost 4 out of 5 said on a research that they would either be very open or somewhat open to their friends or family members talking about their faith with them if that was important to them. In another question, over half of unchurched people said that they would respond positively if they were to receive an invitation from a friend or a family member to attend a church service with them, or to attend church in general, that they wouldn't be put off by that invitation, and that they would actually consider it. Over half of the unchurched said that, yeah, they would be interested to give real consideration if they were asked to attend church with somebody. Another 33% of unchurched indicated that they are likely to attend church regularly at some point in the future. In other words, people that presently aren't attending church at all right now, they fit that category of the unchurched. When asked about their future plans, a full 1/3 of them said, yeah, I actually plan at some point down the road to be attending church. In other words, there's a real desire and an anticipation on their part that they do want to and will be involved in church. And so their reason presently for being unchurched is something other than, church isn't my thing, or they're put off by it, or I had a bad experience and I'm never going back. Oftentimes it's people that moved to a new area, maybe when they went to college, or they moved and they just haven't really found the right church yet. Maybe they haven't been invited by anybody yet, haven't taken the time to look, and for various reasons, they've kind of got out of the habit of going to church, but they want to get back to church at some point. They just haven't yet. And so they're completely ripe to somebody coming and inviting them. Hey, would you consider coming to my church? Or has anyone invited you to church? We'd love to have you join us. Here's how we do church, or here's where we do it and when. And a full third of people would be open because they want to go somewhere. Interestingly and surprisingly, just amongst the millennials, that number goes from 33% up to 39%. 39% of millennials see themselves somewhere down the road, not just being a part of a church, but being regularly involved in church. And then finally, another statistic that I highlighted as I was reading this book is that 62% of non-Christians said that they would be interested in talking with a person about faith so long as that person was willing to listen to them without judgment and who didn't try to force a decision. In other words, they're very open to talking. 2/3 of them said they would be interested in talking about this issue of faith, so long as it was a dialogue and not a monologue. What people today were far more resistant of was the person who came up and they kind of presented themselves as having all the answers and knowing everything. And basically, I'm here to preach to you to tell you what you need. Now, as Christians, there's a part of that we say, well, yeah, but we do have the truth. And we do want to see those people make a decision. But we have to be winsome. We have to be careful. And this is, I think, what Peter says way back where in 1 Peter 3, where he says we need to always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason of the hope that is in you. And then he says that we're to do it with gentleness, with tactfulness. We're not to be sort of a preachy, you're a rotten sinner and you need to repent. There needs to be an element of humility, a willingness to talk to them, to listen, ask good questions. And so if you have friends or family members who would fit that category of unchurched, maybe they know they're not saved, maybe they say they're saved, but they don't go to church anywhere. Their life at least raises questions about it. Maybe it would be helpful just to try the approach of just talking to them, just having conversations and genuinely trying to listen. Hey, where are you? Hey, why did you stop going to church? I'm just curious. Like, what was it about your experience that wasn't working for you, or that you didn't enjoy, or was there something that you found off-putting? And just open up that dialogue and see if down the road it might give you opportunities and avenues to prod further and to challenge them when you've developed that relationship, to consider embracing the gospel. I've shared various times from the pulpit over the years that evangelism is not one of my strengths. It's not something that I feel gifted at. It's not something that comes natural to me for various reasons. I don't have a lot of unsaved people in my life. My family, most of my close friends are almost all Christians. I work with Christians, and so it's hard for me to kind of make those relationships. Some of it's personality type, but this has never been something that comes easy to me. But I recently joined as a pastor. I recently joined a local cohort of pastors. Pastor Kevin and I are part of this group, and the goal of it is to increase our evangelistic fervor within our own community. And the first year is focusing in on us as individuals, and then year 2 is intended for us to focus on our church and how can we help improve the culture of our own church in this regard. And so that's actually where I was exposed to this book, You Found Me. But on the very first session when we were there, we were encouraged to make a list of people in our life that fit this category of the unchurched that we are or will begin to be praying regularly for. And as I was trying to put together my own list, the first person who came to my mind is a friend of mine from all the way back in high school named Chris. I've referenced him before, and some of you remember, but I had led him to the Lord in high school, and he had begun attending church with me, but after we graduated high school and went our separate ways, he had kind of walked away from church, at least, and he hasn't been in church for the last 22 years. And so I've kept in contact with him, but he came to my mind, and we were also encouraged not only with who we're going to pray for, but how we might engage them in gospel ways. And so as I thought about that question, I don't know why I hadn't thought of this before, but I really feel like the Holy Spirit prompted me with the thought, why don't you ask Chris if he would want to read the Bible together with you? If he would want to, read the Bible throughout the week and then get together via the internet to talk about it. And so I committed to doing that, but, interestingly, for the next 3 or 4 weeks, I was kind of afraid. I was kind of afraid that it would be awkward. I'd bring it up. He wouldn't really want to, but he'd kind of feel like I'm his friend and he has to. And so, I had those same fears probably that most of you have. And he tried calling me at one point, and I wasn't able to pick up the phone. But when I saw it again, I was reminded I need to make this phone call to him, and I need to ask him this. I've been praying about it, and I need to follow through. So a couple days later, when I called Chris, I prayed and I said, God, please help this to be able to come up naturally in our conversation, just that I could talk to him about talking about the Bible together on a weekly basis. And it was so interesting. Early in the conversation, I don't remember what was said, but I'm pretty sure he just brought it up. He said, hey, Mike, coolest thing happened. My sister, who lives in Pennsylvania, my sister found my Bible that you had given me way back in high school, and she mailed it to me. And I thought to myself, wow, what a lead-in, to a question like that. And so I didn't bring it up right away, but we were going through the conversation, and near the end, I said, hey, Chris, before we hang up, there's something I've actually been praying about, something I've been wanting to ask you. I'm curious if you'd want to read the Bible a couple chapters a week, and then we'll get together and we'll just talk about it, particularly here with the quarantine that's going on. We're at home a lot more. And he said, oh, I would really be interested in doing that. He had genuine interest and a desire to do that. And he was so thankful. He thanked me for being a true friend and being willing to bring this up. And then he specifically told me, he goes, Mike, I'm really concerned for my wife because my wife is not a believer and I haven't been living like a believer for over 20 years. And, I don't even know how to bring it up to her. Like, I wouldn't be able to answer any questions. I haven't been living it. And I really want to do this. As much as anything, I want to be able to talk to her about Jesus. So we began doing this, and interesting, this last Monday when we were talking, it was our third session, I asked Chris, after we were pretty much done, I said, so, hey, your wife, has this created any opportunities for you to talk to her? How has she thought about this? And he gave me this look like, kind of pointed that way. Then he kind of up and left, and he told me, he goes, she was actually in the room next door. He's pretty sure she might have been able to hear, and he was hopeful that she was listening to our discussion, but he wasn't sure. And so anyways, we ended in prayer, and 15, 20 minutes later, he texted me. He said she was listening the whole time. She heard everything we said. And he goes, I don't know why I made it so awkward and walked out when you asked me that. But so I texted him back, said, well, what did she say? Was she interested? Was this something that appealed to her? And he said, yeah. He texted back, said, yeah, she was interested. I got to walk her through the Sermon on the Mount, just kind of the high points of it from our discussion, because we've been going through Matthew together. And that just excited my heart. That I don't know where this will lead or where this will go, but something as simple as asking someone that I know, would you want to read the Bible together and talk about it? And it seems to be going in a direction where Chris, and certainly his wife, who doesn't know the Lord at all, is beginning to be exposed to the gospel. And so my challenge to you, my encouragement to you would be that you would look for ways that you could pray. Hey, who is in my life already? Who is it that I could be praying for if I'm not already? And what would be some ways that I could intentionally try to engage them. Maybe it's inviting them to church. Maybe there's somebody you know that doesn't go to church somewhere, and you've had those fears of, I don't want to make our relationship awkward by bringing up church. I'll wait and see if they bring it up. Or, and just kind of taking that step prayerfully of inviting someone to church, or inviting them into a Bible study, or prayerfully thinking of how to begin a conversation with them. Look for a way to have a gospel interaction with somebody in your life that you might put on the readiness of the gospel of peace. But then there's a second way in which I think we put on these shoes of readiness, and that is this. We must put on a readiness to maintain peace with others who are inside the church. We must put on a readiness to maintain peace with others who are inside the church. When you look at the book of Ephesians and what it says about the gospel and what it says about the peace that it brings, one of the things that it talks about is the importance of the peace that it brings in our relationship vertically with God. But much of what it says, it actually has more to say about how the gospel brings about, or should bring about, peace horizontally with our relationships with each other. In fact, chapters 2 and 3 of Ephesians has a lot to say about the Jew and Gentile relationship within the church and how the gospel breaks down those walls, those barriers between very different people who were opposed to each other, people who were enemies. But the gospel brings people together. We looked just recently here at Ephesians 2, 8, and 9. Which is all about the gospel and how it puts us in a right relationship vertically with God. But it immediately kind of goes a few verses later, and it transitions into then the horizontal impact that the gospel has in bringing peace. Ephesians 2, verses 13 through 17, it says this, "But now, in Christ Jesus, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one, and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility, by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man," this unity, "in place of the two, so making peace. And he might reconcile us both to God in one body through the cross, thereby killing the hostility. And he came and preached peace to you who were far off, and peace to those who were near. For through him we both have access in one spirit to the Father." And so it's this language of peace that the gospel makes people who are at hostility with each other, people who are at odds with each other, it brings them together. There's a unifying element here. And so I think it's important for us to recognize that I think part of putting on the readiness of the gospel of peace is, are we ready to apply the peace that we have with God already in our relationships with other like-minded people who like-mindedly have a relationship with God, other believers? I think there's a reality here that one cannot be at peace with God when he refuses to make peace with others, particularly other believers. We've already touched on this, and I don't want to camp too long on it, but we've looked previously at the importance of bitterness and how bitterness is such a tool that Satan uses to try to put wedges between people within the church, to try to bring dissension. And it's a way that we give an open door to Satan. This is why in Ephesians chapter 5, one chapter earlier, Paul said, "Do not let the sun go down on your anger. Do not give place to the devil." It's that idea that we open up the door to Satan, one of his major strategies of bringing dissension when we refuse to forgive, when we refuse to be a peacemaker with others. This is why Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, verses 23 and 24, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. Whatever else that verse is saying, he's clearly bringing out the relationship between, if we want to have a right relationship vertically with us and God, we have to make sure that we are maintaining a right relationship horizontally with others. If we are harboring bitterness and jealousy and conceit and rivalry and anger between people horizontally, particularly our brothers and sisters in Christ, we are not right with God. And our life is wide open to Satan's attacks. There's an interesting passage over in the book of James, chapter 3, verses 14 through 18, where he says, if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, notice words like bitter, jealous, selfish ambition. He says, this is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but it is earthly, unspiritual, and get this, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. On the contrast, then, he says the wisdom from above, the mindset, the thinking, the way that God sees things, that sort of wisdom is peaceable, gentle, open to reason, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. It doesn't just treat some people with that kind of reconciliation mindset. It's impartial. It tries to keep peace with everyone. And then he ends it by saying, and a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Part of what it means to put on the shoes of the readiness of the gospel of peace is that we are ready to combat Satan's strategy of rivalry and bitterness and jealousy and anger and harboring ill feelings toward others by being peacemakers. We are ready to go to others with the gospel of peace that says, hey, you're a believer. You've been forgiven by Jesus. As one who has been forgiven by Jesus, you are able to forgive others. You are able to love the unlovable because you were loved by God. Even when you were his enemy, he reached out to you in reconciliation to love you, to forgive you, to reconcile you, and you then are able to do that as well. That's the gospel. Neil Anderson, in his book, The Bondage Breaker, which I've alluded to throughout this series, he says this. He says, the shoes of peace become protection against the divisive schemes of the devil when you act as a peacemaker among believers. I hope that as you think about the gospel and what it means to you, that part of what the gospel of peace is that it's a call for you to recognize I can be at peace with others and to recognize Satan wants to keep me in a mindset of animosity toward others. I have got to guard that. Daily, I've got to put on these shoes of the readiness of the gospel of peace where I am prepared, as Paul says elsewhere, as much as is in you to live peaceably with others. I am prepared to go and make things right and to demonstrate love to my enemies as much as it is within my ability to do that. Jason's going to wrap things up here with a video that is an object lesson for us on this issue of the peace of the gospel.
Pastor Mike has been talking to us about having our feet shod with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. And when I think about feet and readiness, I think about dogs and cats. Dogs and cats are totally different critters, and I know you know that. There's lots of differences about dogs and cats. But their feet is one of the most significant. Let me show you some examples. God designed a dog's foot to always have the claws exposed. They're out there for traction and to help the dog run. A cat, on the other hand, has the claws retracted most of the time. It doesn't get this added benefit. Cats reserve their claws for the kill or climbing trees. Here, we're going to watch a pack of wolves chase down a rabbit. You'll notice they just run. A dog, a wolf, a fox, it's known as a coursing predator. They run the thing down until the prey is exhausted and gives up the chase, at which point a dog uses its teeth to make the kill and get the meal. Here, these wolves are chasing a rabbit, and as most nature shows go, it's not going to end well for the rabbit. But these wolves are on the chase, and they run, and they run, and they run. Not so for cats. Here we have a video of cats chasing antelope, and you'll notice that the lions don't just run down the prey. It's stalking and strategizing and creeping and hiding. A cat is not a coursing predator, it's an ambush predator. When all the other lions are ready to go, they'll send one lion in to be seen and spring the trap. And then again, it doesn't end well for these antelope. But the lions don't use their claws to gain traction. They use their claws for the kill. Dogs, you'll notice, when they get outside, run and run and run, and this is what dogs do to have fun. My dog loves to run, and this is its readiness to run with its track cleats always out. Dogs are runners. Big ones, small ones, and medium-sized flopsy ones like mine. Cats, on the other hand, when you let them out, they do this. Cats are not known for running, which is why professional greyhound racing is a thing. Professional cat racing, though, something else.
And they've both been out of the seat a while, so they're a little confused. And they're off. Simba has lost traction. And he's and he's taken out both cones at the finish line. Simba is smoking the tires, but he is not giving up. And we have a race.
So are you more like a dog or a cat in your readiness to present the gospel of peace? Cats have to think about it. They consider it, they plan, they strategize, they creep around, they get ready, and then they spring on their prey. Dogs can be laying around 1 minute and go, oh, rabbit, and they're off on the chase. They're always ready to go. In this particular sense, I hope you're more like a dog than a cat. Let's be ready at all times to bring the gospel of peace to bear in our lives and in the lives of those around us. God bless you.
Well, as you in your homes begin to bring things to a conclusion, I'd like you to have some meaningful discussion with the people in your room there together. And I'd like you to consider 3 questions. Number 1, I'd like you to name 1 or 2 unchurched people that you are praying regularly for, or that you should begin to pray regularly for, that they would move in the direction of being a committed follower of Jesus. So, maybe as a family, you would adopt a couple of people that all of you know, or maybe each member of the family's got 1 or 2 or 3 people even that come to your mind, your friends at school, your coworkers, maybe you have family members that aren't churched right now. They're not going to church. It's kind of hard to know where they're at in their walk with God, and you'd like to commit together as a family to pray for these individuals. Who would they be? And then secondly, I'd like you to answer this question together and discuss this. What are the primary obstacles that each of you face in sharing your own faith more regularly with the unchurched people in your life? There's a lot of obstacles we face. I shared some that I face in our message. It could relate to your own personality. It could relate to fears. It could relate to just not having many friends or family members that don't know Jesus and trying to figure out how to build those relationships. It could be that you're not very well prepared to answer some of the common questions that you anticipate. Whatever. What are the obstacles primarily that you face as you think about your own life and your own faithfulness or regularity in sharing Christ with others? And then thirdly, what are some things that you would like to begin doing to remove some of those obstacles so that your life would be more characterized as one who consistently puts on the shoes of readiness of the gospel of peace? What are things you can begin to do? What are some changes you could make? What are some ways you could be better prepared that you would like to commit to moving forward?